I'd like to also thank the panelists for coming and the folks at MIT Enterprise Forum to help organizing, specifically Eric Vieira and Mary Howard. I'm I'm a professor here at Pace University and the director of the Entrepreneurship program, and I'm on the board of the MIT Enterprise Forum here in New York City and served on the global board. So in looking at New York City's recovery from not only 9/11, but more recently from the financial crisis of 2008, I was always interested in how New York has come back so quickly and built this entrepreneurial ecosystem that we have. I think that there's a lot of things to take credit. I think the Mayor Bloomberg deserves a lot of credit. He's been a real pragmatist and has really put in a strategy. But it's much broader than one person. There's again this idea of an ecosystem, and when you think what exactly is the ecosystem, there's all kinds of things. There's soft things like the quality of life. I mean, living in New York City, in 1973 instead of 2013, 30 years ago was very, very different. And the perception of desirability of wanting to be here in New York City, has changed and adds to the ecosystem. So there's things that always come to mind as well: the availability of funding, access to capital. There's things that you might not think of that much, like networking organizations. For example, the MIT Enterprise Forum, tech meetup, et cetera. There's big things like having really talented people, engineers and a technical workforce. There's little things like access to high-speed internet, now these days called the fourth utility. The local government, cutting red tape, federal government, immigration policy, is a big thing. So there's all kinds of factors that influence the entrepreneurial ecosystem. Again, federal, state, local government, nonprofit organizations, advocacy groups, private firms, large corporations that you just heard the dean talk about, a number of them, small and medium-sized enterprises, individual entrepreneurs, solo professionals, customer partners, suppliers. All of these things make up part of our ecosystem. And of course, tonight's focus is on the role of universities in that ecosystem. And I think there's things that come to mind when you say, what role do universities play? Things like tech transfer and, of course, providing an education to students to be able to fill these positions, skilled positions in this knowledge workforce. But there's many, many other things as well. And the universities, and that could go from like P-Tech or Pathways in Technology, what does it stand for? Pathways in Technology, Early College, High School, which is part of like the Board of Education in CUNY, all the way to the new campus that's being opened for Cornell NYC Tech on Roosevelt Island. What I'm particularly excited about tonight's panel is we have a mixture of the different universities. So, we have a design school, a Columbia University with tech, Mount Sinai Medical School, and New York City Economic Development Corp, which of course has been, instrumental in fostering, our very successful entrepreneurial ecosystem here in New York City. I just thought I'd, to read, there's a book that just came out. I read it, I really enjoyed it. It's called Tech in the City, Making of New York City Startup Community. Is Alessandro here, by the way? Okay, he said that he was going to try to come. So, chapter 18, A Virtuous Cycle, How Academia is Interacting with Startups. And let me just read this. In Silicon Valley, Stanford plays a big role in stabilizing the economic cycle, constantly going up and down, adds the co-founder, Eric Korth, who's one of the co-founders of Hack NY and a professor of computer science at New York University. He goes on to say, something we did wrong the first time around in the 90s was not having strong connective tissue between the startup community and academic institutions. We don't have Stanford here, but we have a bunch of really strong universities that combined are much bigger than Stanford. And I don't just mean NYU and Columbia. I mean CUNY, Parsons, Pace, Cornell, and then looking to the bigger circle, I think of Syracuse, Carnegie Mellon, and all of these other schools. We must pull them together to strengthen the connections to the startup community. So Again, the book Tech in the City, it was, just published in March of last year. So with that, I wanted to ask each of the panelists to briefly introduce themselves, and then we'll go into some questions, and we'll save some time at the end for questions from the audience. So why don't we start with Jeff?
Great. Well, thanks for having me. My name is Jeff Smith. I'm a professor in the Department of Health Evidence and Policy at Mount Sinai School of Medicine, and I'm the founding director of the Center for Technology, Innovation, and Entrepreneurship. Prior to joining the faculty at Mount Sinai, I taught for 6 years at Rockefeller University, where I founded the Science and Economics program, and I spent a little over 20 years as a serial entrepreneur and venture capitalist in the life sciences area.
Hi, my name's Deb Johnson, and I am the executive director of the Center for Sustainable Design Strategies at Pratt Institute. I came out of the industrial design program, and it was during my period there as chair of that program that I started the Pratt Design Incubator, which was really there to be a launching pad for the great ideas that our students were coming up with that were turning into portfolio pieces and just evaporating. And we're just about, so we're about a over 10-year organization, and we're just expanding to create the Brooklyn Fashion and Design Accelerator, where we will host 30 companies and surround them with the resources that they need to go from idea to production to sales.
So I'm Hertzkowitz from Columbia University. I'm technically the vice president for intellectual property and tech transfer. What that practically means is I run the tech transfer office for the university. We can talk about what that is later. I'm also a faculty member in the business school, teaching a class on intellectual property for startups and managers, which is now this year going to be joined with the engineering school. I have the privilege to sit on a number of exciting cross-university initiatives around New York, with Eric on the New York City Media Lab, on the recently launched Power Bridge New York, which is an effort to get clean energy startups going across, I think, 7 of the New York City research institutions. And Harlem Biospace, which is the new biotech incubator launched right around the corner from Columbia. But I'm just one of many people at the university who are trying to get great things going with entrepreneurship. Vince Ponzo's in the audience, please raise your hand, from the business school as well. So it's an exciting time to be in New York City. I was a consultant before joining Columbia with the Boston Consulting Group.
Great. Eric Gertler, thank you for including me on the panel. As Oren says, I'm the guy with the tie on the panel. And well, thank you, Deborah.
She's in Pratt.
Right. I'm going to say very nice things about you today. And I actually think that that's an important symbol for this, because for 15 years prior to joining the government and being part of EDC, I was an entrepreneur in the community, and as someone asked me what was the biggest difference about the private sector and the public sector, and I said I had not worn a tie 3 days straight in 15 years. Which actually goes to the culture and the ecosystem here, that in New York, you think back 25 years, it was total heresy to walk around not wearing a tie. And today you can get accepted, actually not wearing a tie, and stand out when you are wearing a tie. I run the Center for Economic Transformation at the EDC, which is the EDC's efforts to increase job growth and also economic diversification. We've been particularly active post the Great Recession in 2008, and just one comment which I think is pretty interesting. When I look at the panel, as Oren said, we're on the Media Lab together, but all of us have been integrated, and that just goes to show you the strength of the ecosystem here in New York. Jeffrey and I were in a meeting a few weeks ago. Pace University, our offices are 3 blocks away. We hold our big sort of company government meetings here. And Deborah likes my tie, so we're all integrated, and I look forward to this discussion.
Okay, so I thought one way to open it, as I mentioned, I'm sure people here in the audience realize that universities are important. I mean, I think one of the most important things is talent, and universities draw in talent from around the world. There's really is a war for talent, and so many of the startups are started by people that from overseas. I think in Silicon Valley, something like 40% of startups have on their founding team someone who immigrated to the United States. And we know, as again, things like tech transfer or holding competitions, holding conferences, doing some consulting work. But I thought I'd ask the panel what they could point to as some of the unique ways that universities help foster New York City's entrepreneurial ecosystem that the general public might not be aware of. And I'm happy to. We can start with Jeff. We'll start with her.
So, when we look at the ecosystem in New York, we think about three essential pillars to building the ecosystem, and it's really about talent, infrastructure, and community. But talent is number one, and and that is talent to the founders of companies. That is the talent to managers. That's the talent for technical people. And so, above all else, I think that access is, or the development of talent is essential. The main point that I want to make on this is a number of years ago, we did a sort of what we call a game-changing exercise, and we interviewed hundreds of people in the community to determine what is the biggest thing that we could do in New York City to change the landscape from now and for the next 30 years. And what we heard resoundingly from all of the work that we did was that we needed to have a greater sense or increased amount of applied science in cooperation with the universities. And it became, abundantly clear, and maybe it should have been obvious, but that rose to the top of what everybody in the community was suggesting, which led to the applied science initiatives, the development of Cornell Technion, the expansion of Columbia and NYU Poly, and we'll actually be announcing more with respect to that, but it just gives you a sense of, not just on our mind, but how important the role of universities are to developing the ecosystem in any community, let alone New York.
So I'll jump in, although we don't always have to go in order, I suppose. So primarily, universities do many things, but two of the most important are training students and providing the educational, education for them, and then the basic research that goes on, whether it's at a hospital, an academic medical center, or within the research departments across the university. So my view tends to be, in the tech transfer office, my view tends to be focused on the researchers, just by the nature of the role. So what we do is when the faculty at the university or the graduate students come up with scientific inventions, tech transfer offices, and all the universities and medical centers in New York have one, evaluate those inventions for commercial potential and for patentability. We file patents on the inventions that come out, and then try to start companies based off of them, or find larger companies that will take them in and make them a home. So those two primary functions for the university both contribute to the local ecosystem. So in some ways, the research is a little bit less local. Some of those ideas, ideas are global. So they go off and they become part of larger corporations, and they get turned into products that change people's lives for the better for generations to come across the whole world. In some cases, if they're startups, they can be more local, and they can help the New York City community or the New York State in ways that can build jobs and taxes and exports and all the things that you want if you're a government official. The students are also, it's very important, because the students come to New York. Who doesn't like living in New York? It's a great place to be. And hopefully they graduate, and if they can find something interesting to do here, they stay. And what we're seeing, which is fascinating, is the number of students on campus who are becoming increasingly passionate about finding a way to have a career focused on entrepreneurship in New York City has exploded. And thankfully, so have the opportunities to have a career in entrepreneurship in the city. It's very, very exciting. But they're starting their own companies or joining many of the other opportunities that exist here. It's been great to see.
I agree with everything that's been said. And coming from the design side and art side, we're really focused on the culture and developing and making keeping the culture of the city vibrant, and bringing in the people who are kind of the edgy people who are kind of pushing the boundaries. And when we look at working with the research companies, like one of the projects that we did was working with a biomedical engineer up at Columbia, Sam Sia, to help him actually create a product from the research that he was doing that would work out in the field successfully. So while you have all of this research, the design comes in to actually turn it into usable product. And that, I think, is a really synergistic relationship between kind of what the universities are bringing into the environment.
Actually, just to jump in there, Sam's a really interesting case study too, because not only is he a faculty member at Columbia, and he formed a company when he was up at MIT, which then got sold recently. He's formed 2 companies since then. One is in the process of doing so now. He's also the person who founded Harlem Biospace, the incubator up near Columbia, to try and help the next generation of bioscience entrepreneurs. So he's sort of attacking this problem from all possible angles.
So, I think the interesting thing about universities is kind of the history in the United States, at least from the life sciences side, of funding. So up until 1930, there was no federal funding for basic research in the United States. And in 1930, the Ransdell's Act was passed, and it was the first time the federal government stepped in to fund. And the reason they did is that the private market was failing to fund basic research. We'd come out of the war, we're in the Depression, money wasn't available. And then as you went ahead in the post-World War II period, this social contract where the federal government provided resources for basic science, and in return the universities turned that information out to the public to be used, really was solidified. And then we got to 1980. And in 1980 there was this feeling that, boy, we're really falling behind economically, and so we changed the law. We passed the Bayh-Dole Act, which said that universities could now make money off that research that the federal government had funded. And what we've seen since 1980 then is a sea change in the orientation of universities toward the commercial realm. And if you actually read the Bayh-Dole Act, in the actual prescription in the act is that the act was designed to get universities to work with commercial entities. And so we want that. And so, the pure academic may say, I'm a pure academic, and I'm not going to get into that whole filthy money business. But the reality is we need it, and it's a continuum. And so in the life sciences, we need the federal funding to create the seed corn, the basic insights, which we then have to foster into products, drugs, devices that can help patients. And I think increasingly universities are realizing this is something that's not going to happen just randomly or by osmosis. We have to act with forethought. We have to create new programs. And so there are folks from NYU who are doing that, Columbia's doing that, Mount Sinai has made a big effort in this area. The design world has gotten more engaged with this. And so I think when people start to talk about that ecosystem, it's been a natural evolution actually over a fairly long period of time. And what we're witnessing now is kind of the coming together of these different threads. The administrations of the universities are realizing this is important because maybe those federal dollars aren't quite as available as they once were. The entrepreneurs are realizing that the talent and that the ideas are in the universities, and so they're coming to find what they can develop. And so I actually think that New York is in a particularly exciting period for this, with the efforts that the EDC has supported and with the activities of the universities as a group.
I think that coming together of the universities to share and leverage the resources that we all have and bring to the table is really kind of the critical thing that's happening now, and exciting to see happening.
So if we could pick up on that, I think that's an excellent point. It was interesting. I was talking about the SBIC program for lending to students last night, and that was started in 1958 by President Eisenhower as a response to Sputnik, realizing that how are we going to get ahead in the space race? It's going to be investment in these kind of technologies. And I think not only for the professor in schools, I think schools also, another reason they're excited is when alums come back and give $100 million gifts, they realize we should have entrepreneurship programs. But if we could pick up on that point and talk about how would you envision schools working closer together? I mean, here we are all on the same island, and this is the first time we've met for me. What kind of program do you think would be particularly valuable? What would you like to see? Any thoughts or suggestions, as far as a consortium, maybe shared like MakerBot spaces, and anything?
Yeah, I'll jump in to kick things off on that. So Mount Sinai is a biomedical institution, and so our professors, our students, our activities are much around the life sciences. But I'm a big believer in what the design world has to offer us. And so one of the opportunities that we're interested in is reaching out to partner with design programs. We do not have an engineering school. Increasingly, engineering is absolutely critical to the type of translational work that we want to do. And so we're reaching out. We've recently created a partnership with Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute up in Troy, which is a superb engineering school, doesn't have an academic medical counterpart. I've worked closely with the Zahn Center at CUNY, which is a wonderful entrepreneurship program that has maker facilities in space and all. And so, again, I think you're starting to see that. Again, the tradition is that universities want to do everything themselves, and Columbia's the competition. But I think increasingly those walls are breaking down, and partly I want to get this in. There's a professor at Harvard Business School named Howard Stevenson, and he defines entrepreneurship as the pursuit of opportunity without regard to resources currently controlled. And it's a great thing. And so there are a lot of resources I don't control. I don't control a design school. But as an entrepreneur, I want to reach out and create that relationship. And I think increasingly universities are open, or schools in general are open.
So, from my perspective, when I look at some of the best things that we've done and something that's a model for the future, is that where you have these tripartite relationships where you've got government working with universities, working with the private sector, we find that those can lead to some of the biggest and best outcomes. And it's on a whole variety of levels. Some of our most successful incubators, we have an incubator on Varick with NYU. It's EDC, bringing together money with the university, bringing in private companies into the incubator, mentoring them. The successes that we've had from that, $100+ million raise, many companies forming, lots of jobs, hugely successful. The Media Lab is another example. You bring together the government with the universities. You go to the private sector to raise money to develop research within the universities to better, to better the work of some of these industries. The life sciences, as Jeffrey points out, it's a great area. We're about to announce soon a fund to deal with early stage life sciences companies to help foster and spur that. Again, it was the government coming together with private industry, with all the leaders of the academic medical centers to help solve a problem. And I can go on and give you example after example, but I think in the world that we live in, that's moving so quickly, that's so focused on a knowledge-based economy, that you need to combine the collective assets of all of these institutions to get to a whole other level.
Yeah, coming from the private sector previously, I would say one of the great joys of the last 8 years has been that you can turn to people, you can turn to other institutions that one might, if it were the private sector, they would have been your competition. And you could say, how do we make this better? Now, how do we work together to make this better? And so some of it's about sharing resources. Some of it's about coming together to go after things that you couldn't do on your own. So just by way of example, about 5 or 6 years ago, all the academic medical centers in New York got together and said, each of us alone are having trouble attracting the best investors, the best VCs to come to New York, or the ones in New York to come to see us and see all the great companies that could get started. So we got together as a group, and once or twice a year now, and actually it was just yesterday at Sloan Kettering this time, but we all get together and we put forth 2 or 3 most fundable companies that are emerging from the university in front of an audience of 200 to 300 of the big pharma companies, the medical device firms, and the investors. They wouldn't have shown up if it was just Columbia or just Sloan Kettering or just Mount Sinai, but if they can see 15 to 20 ideas all at once, that's worth coming. Similarly, I mentioned the Power Bridge effort earlier, but that's Columbia, so NYSERDA, which is the New York State Energy Research Development Authority, it's part of the state government. They put out a proposal to try and create more energy-related startups in New York. Columbia got together with NYU Poly, Cornell, CUNY, SUNY Stony Brook, and Brookhaven National Labs, and put in a joint proposal and ended up winning a $10 million grant to get these companies off the ground over the next 5 years. We just launched a couple of weeks ago and got 50 proposals from researchers at the institutions to create startups. The first question people ask is, weren't you fighting like cats and dogs over who's going to be in the lead? And the answer is not at all, because this helps everybody.
I think the development of collaboration in competitive environments is critical. I work with a group of 30 art and design colleges around the issue of sustainability, and the presidents of the institutions were all incredibly concerned that we were going to be stealing each other's students. And what we've been able to do is advance sustainability in the academic environment much more quickly than they would have been able to do on their own, because we're sharing resources, we're able to do faculty development together, we're able to afford to make change rather than sit there in our silos and try to figure out how to get those resources together to actually implement change. And it's the way of the future. The world is too complex now to be able to sit over here, have all of the parts and pieces that you need, and think you're going to do something.
It's also just worth noting, we've talked a lot about the launching new ventures part of this, but in terms of at the sort of institutional level, it's worth noting this is actually true at the student level as well. So you've got groups like Hack NY, which is a collaboration between Evan Korth at NYU and Chris Wiggins at Columbia and Hillary Mason at Bitly, to try and take engineering students who otherwise might have gone off to Wall Street, not that there's anything wrong with Wall Street, and to introduce them to what entrepreneurship can be like and what startups can be like in New York. And the same institutions got together to put forth NY CRIN, which Frank's one of the faculty on, which is the NSF's I-Core sort of new business accelerator program, which has been a great success.
And just speaking of new technology, so Twitter IPO'd yesterday and is up 80% today. And I just wanted to mention on the cover, it has Twitter, we're using the hashtag ENTNYC, and you could also, MIT EFNYC at the end if you want to tweet in a question or keep the rest of the world apprised of what's going on. That would be great. But we talked about the change, and I'm interested both to hear from the institutional level what you've seen the change, particularly around entrepreneurship, because universities were not very entrepreneurial a short time ago. I mean, if you came and said I wanted to study entrepreneurship, they would have thought, what are you doing in a university? PACE's program actually started back in 1979. It's one of the earlier programs. And from the 80s, you've seen this big boom in entrepreneurship at universities. Can you talk a little bit about how it's been to, on an institutional level, and then maybe we'll talk from the student perspective next, but on an institutional level, dealing with chancellors and presidents and provosts and other schools on bringing the entrepreneurship message across campus?
Well, I can speak from the perspective of a small or relatively small private institution where there wasn't necessarily a focus on what do they do once they leave. And it was, I think, really something that I had to convince the school to do, which was to start to say, we're going to try to provide a place where people can take their ideas and do something with them without it necessarily driving tuition back into the system. And so that, I think, was the difficulty for me, was to convince them that this was a critical part of the educational process, and that much like the gym or the library, these were necessary resources that needed to surround our students, and that we were making a commitment to educate these people and put them out in the world to have successful careers, and that we needed to take that next step, that we needed to create models, role models, so that, and that's why I started the incubator on the Pratt campus originally, was for our students to start see other students starting businesses and go, wow, Sam can do that, maybe I can do that. It was very basic in that way. But the school didn't quite understand why it was important for a long time.
So, Mount Sinai, I think, looked out and said, gee, if you look where our PhDs are going 5 years out, they're not all going to academic jobs. Actually, it turns out the alternative career path was actually the majority career path. More of them were going to non-academic jobs than academic jobs. And if you look at the postdoc community, which is one of the largest communities on campus, postdocs were very interested in potentially pursuing other areas. And then when they looked at the opportunity to translate that government-funded research into entrepreneurial opportunities, I think they came together and said this needs to be part of our strategic plan. And so, at least for Sinai, it started at the top. It started with the absolute senior leadership. And so when I showed up and said, gee, maybe we should have a new PhD program, or maybe we should think about technology development differently around the faculty, It wasn't even a sale. It was absolutely, this is what needs to happen. And rarely in life do one's expectations get exceeded, but my expectations for how nimble the school would be and how supportive the school would be have absolutely been exceeded. And so I'm not sure I've had the normal experience. It's been kind of easy, and within a very short period of time, we've generated a huge amount of activity. And actually, Nicole McKnight is here. Nicole was one of the first students in a class I taught last year on how to develop technology. We had 40 students. They formed 10 teams. At the end of it, we had 10 working prototypes of new technologies. I don't think that was something that a few years ago the school would have envisioned, but they're incredibly supportive of making that happen.
It's interesting when you think about thriving, robust entrepreneurial ecosystems. A university is always at the center of that. In Silicon Valley, Silicon Valley started and grew so quickly because there was Stanford University, and then there were early successes that came out of Silicon Valley. The same thing up in Cambridge. But when you think about New York, I mean, even though we're a city of finance and business and a city of commerce, we didn't really think about entrepreneurialism 15 years ago. And it's only sort of the late 90s when we had our first big internet success story with DoubleClick. And when you talk to the universities 13 years ago, entrepreneurialism was nowhere on the radar. Today every university is thinking about it. They're combining assets. There's a huge amount of stuff going on, and I think that just adds to it. And it's great to see. We have so many assets in New York, and that in some sense, from an entrepreneurial standpoint, we were way behind, but we've caught up very quickly. Last year, New York went to become the #2 center in terms of venture capital money, which just goes to show you that we're catching up, and it really is. As we said earlier, a combination of all the factors, but the university is playing a much bigger role.
I'll note. So from my perspective up at Columbia, having been there about 8 years, so it's only covering the last 8 years, but there's always been a lot of activity and support for entrepreneurship at Columbia, but it's been somewhat fragmented, I guess is the way to put it. There's been great support for it. There's been classes taught all around the university on entrepreneurship. But increasingly what you're seeing now, and there's an initiative at Columbia called Columbia Entrepreneurship, fairly appropriately, to try and knit together all of these efforts to be more of a sort of a seamless web of opportunities. So what you'll have now, and we're even seeing this at the researcher level. So when I joined, our office was helping 7 or so startups a year emerge from the university based on patented technologies. And these days, it's up to 15 or 16 every year. So we've nearly doubled in 7 years. And part of that is because there's been organic growth in entrepreneurship within each department, but a significant chunk of that is because we're seeing the engineers working with the